This video is to help anyone that is remote learning. This is to help you complete the Analyzing Political Speeches worksheet. And we are continuing with Old Major. We did part 2 together on the previous video. And what we figured out was the alliteration. 2 examples, many months, crystal clear. Repetition, comrades is repeated, beasts of England, beasts of Ireland. Metaphor, I actually had the class put an X through that. But an example of metaphor would be, yet he is Lord of all the animals, and it was a dream of the earth. Rhetorical question, I'm not going to write in because any question that Old Major asks inside of his speech is a rhetorical question. So whenever you open the speech document, any question you can write down, okay? Just one question in this box, because any question is for effect. He doesn't expect the animal audience to answer. And allusion, historical or literary reference, it occurs on the last page, okay? So what I want you to do for this one is take a look at the last page. What Old Major does is refers to a song that his mom sang to him. What is the name of that song? That is what you're going to put in this box, okay? And that will finish your part 2 for Old Major. Let's go ahead and do part 1 for Old Major. Describe the present situation. Who's benefiting under the current conditions? Old Major, as you listen to that speech, he described that the humans are the ones who are benefiting. Man is benefiting. And taking advantage of the animals. Let me get that speech to use as a reference. So we see here, man is the only real enemy we have. You cows I see before me, how many thousands of gallons of milk have you given during this last year? And what has happened to that milk? You hens, how many eggs have you laid in this last year? Clover, where are those 4 fowls you bore? So obviously man is taking advantage of these poor animals. Prove unfairness, who's suffering under current conditions? Well, that pretty much answers it, those questions that were just asked. The animals. Animals are producing food and not reaping the benefits. Provide a vision of a better way. We marked this with C on the other video. The soil of England is fertile, its climate is good, it is capable of affording food in abundance. A better way. England has an abundance of produce for animals to enjoy. If it weren't for man. That's his main focus in the speech, is that man is the enemy and animals need to get rid of man. And call for action, what must be done to achieve fair conditions. It's all right here in the speech. Only get rid of man, and the produce of our labor would be our own. Rebellion, I do not know when that rebellion will come, but I know as surely as I see this straw beneath my feet that sooner or later justice will be done. And he continues, no animal must ever live in a house or sleep in a bed or wear clothes or drink alcohol or smoke tobacco or touch money or engage in trade. All the habits of man are evil. What must be done? Rebellion must occur. And man must be defeated. Man's habits should not be adopted. Okay, so now we're going from a fictitious speech of Animal Farm to a very real and very touching, strong, powerful speech, I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. Said this speech in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was calling for equality because this was the time of the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws, boys and girls, was segregation. African Americans and white Americans were separate, and they had separate schools, separate water fountains, movie theaters. African Americans sat on the balcony, white Americans sat on the bottom of the movie theaters, and this segregation had to stop. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in Washington, D.C., calling for an appreciation for diversity. He called for diversity to be seen as something to be appreciated, to be united rather than divided. And he refers to the Emancipation Proclamation in his speech, which took place in January 1st, 1863, which was signed by Abraham Lincoln, which freed slaves, but he didn't say this speech until 1960s. So we see that it takes a long time, or it has taken a long time, for discrimination to gather us and to unite us, and a call for action to occur. And I think it would be naive for us to say that discrimination would ever completely go away. We simply must not be a part of that discrimination. We must be part of the solution, not the problem. We just studied the Holocaust. We saw how anti-Semitism caused the Holocaust. We see in today's lives where racism and discrimination is still alive today, and we have to do our best to love each other for who we are and to appreciate each other's differences. So some things that are highlighted here are our rhetorical tools. Two examples. We'll just do one example. There are several, however. Colors are concerned. Life, liberty are examples of alliteration. One of my favorite examples of alliteration is dark and desolate valley. Another one of my favorites, I'm not sure if I highlighted it when I first did this run through. Dignity and discipline, one of my favorites. Martin Luther King Jr., not only was he a great orator, he was, a great speaker, had a great speaker's presence, but to actually take this speech and look at the wording, magnificent. Examples of repetition. There are several examples. I'm just going to list two here for you. 100 years later is repeated here. He uses repetition for such a magnificent effect. It really grabs your attention and highlights the important points he makes. Another time he uses repetition. Now is the time. And we can never be satisfied. Some of you have come, and the most notable is I have a dream. A metaphor, comparisons to help the listener envision. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Cashing a check is a huge metaphor that he uses within his speech. Rhetorical question happens on the second page of your document. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied. When will you be satisfied? Rhetorical question, a question for effect, not a question meant for the audience to answer. Allusion, historical or literary reference. Our first one comes here, the Emancipation Proclamation, a historical reference. This, as I said at the beginning of the video or near the beginning of the video, is the proclamation that Abraham Lincoln signed in 1863 to free the slaves. He also has this historical reference, Declaration of Independence. Okay. Going back to your first table, describe the present situation. Segregation has divided our nation. The unfairness, lack of equality, let me find a particular line. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of the great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells, and some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow the situation can and will be changed. Lack of equality has caused people to suffer. And King, calls for change. Provide a vision of a better way. He has this throughout his speech, but especially in this I have a dream sequence. Two of my favorite lines. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This one you have probably heard quoted numerous times. Another one that is one of my favorites. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and girls as sisters and brothers. Okay, he is calling for unity. He is calling for all of us to be united as the human race rather than being divided by our ethnicity, rather than being divided by race. So a vision of a better way. Unite rather than divide. Another important point we must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. Looking ahead in this paragraph, in the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. Unite rather than divide, and use peaceful means to achieve this. And our last one, call for action. Somewhat overlaps our vision for a better way. Unlike Old Major calling for rebellion, what Martin Luther King Jr. is calling for is peaceful protest. Peaceful protest must unite everyone as the human race.